Hello and welcome to A Sunny Book Nook. Today I'm going to be talking to you about some of my favorite books that include or incorporate or really have this thematic element of New York City in the background of the book. I think that books that have a really strong sense of place are oftentimes just set up to be good when there's an engaging presence of the city that is really part of the characters and how they are as people and whom they interact with. And I feel like it's just a really cool thing whenever books are set in New York City and it's really obvious that it's set in New York City and it's a big part of the book. So I'm just going to jump into some of these recommendations I have because there are a lot of books on this list. Oh, also, these books are all mostly diverse. I think all of these books, except for maybe two of them, are written by authors of color. So I think that's important too, because I feel like narratives of places should really be told by the people who occupy those places. You know what I mean? So anyways, let's just jump right in. The first book I have on this list is The Afterlife of Holly Chase by Cynthia Hand. This book incorporates New York City into the story as a kind of background setting to a greater plot, which is that we are set in this world in which classic Dickens story of Scrooge and the spirits, the ghosts of Christmas past, present, and future, who come visit him and tell him, hey, you need to get your act together and stop being such a stingy, wealth-hoarding piece of shit. That is now a corporate project called Project Scrooge, in which this company that incorporates some sort of magic and sci-fi into it, just a smidge, go around every year and pick one person to be their Scrooge. And this Scrooge is someone who is typically older and has just been super mean and nasty, but really wealthy their whole life. And now this project is trying to intervene and try to make them a better person. And if you get visited upon Scrooge and you don't take action to be better, you will die. So we're following the perspective of the 17-year-old girl named Holly Chase, who was a Scrooge, and then she died because she did not become a better person. She was really mean to all of the people around her because she was ultimately dealing with the grief of her mother's death. So she is the daughter of this really super rich director, and she now, as a part of her punishment, has to work at Project Scrooge. And Project Scrooge is headquartered in New York City, and we're seeing Holly as this ghost sort of zombie creature. She's permanently stuck in this 17-year-old body, basically, and now she is on this project, on this mission. She's been working there for 5 years now, and suddenly there's this new guy that they are going to try to Project Scroogify, and so she kind of gets involved with him more so than previous Scrooges, because he's also a teenage boy and he's suffering similar things that she has. Because he also lives in New York City, she has to follow him around and visit him in his dreams and his sleep to figure out what his situation is and who the different emotional kind of buttons Project Scrooge can press for him to become a better person. And because of the setting of New York City, they meet up at different clubs, they meet up at the lines in front of the New York City Public Library. Those kind of background elements are sprinkled throughout this entire book. And at the very beginning of the story, Holly Chase talks about how much she hates New York City, but we can see throughout the course of the story, as she changes and as she helps other people change through Project Scrooge, we see how that adjusts. And I think that this story incorporates that New York City setting so well and so wonderfully. And this book is just generally a really solid YA book with a really good message, I think. So I definitely would recommend this one. The next book I have on this list is The Changeling by Victor LaValle. This book is set in New York City, as you may have guessed, and the premise of this story is that there is a father and a mother and they have a child, but something sinister is going on. The father takes a bunch of pictures of his kid and puts it on Facebook because he's a proud dad. So that's one element of the story. Another element of the story is that his wife one day murders their child right in front of him because she says that that child is not actually a child but a monster of some sort. And things unravel from there. It is a really gorgeous, wonderful, heartbreaking story that discusses family, trauma, race, being Black in New York City, and the historical and racial dynamics that go on within the city in the context of this one family and other families and other children that seem to be going mysteriously missing. There are so many elements of like going between the different islands in New York City and just intrigue throughout the city in different boroughs, and how being in different neighborhoods as a Black man, the main character, influences his behaviors and his actions. And it's just a wonderful fantasy story that is really deeply rooted in a sense of place in New York City. So I cannot recommend this book enough. I rated it 5 stars because it is a 5-star read, hands down. I have another Victor LaValle recommendation on this list. I think LaValle just talks about the city in a really interesting way, incorporates that into all of his books. And this book is The Ballad of Black Tom, which is a novella set in Harlem, I think in the early 20th century. And this man is kind of a scammer. This white man kind of approaches him and is like, hey, something's up, you need to come over here, and weird magical things ensue. And I think that the sense of Harlem and just trying to get by and going between like Flushing and, you know, all these different boroughs in New York and neighborhoods is just a really well incorporated element of this short story that you should definitely check out. The next book I have on this list is The City We Became by NK Jemisin. This book I think, obviously embodies the city, because in this fantasy story, we are following these different characters who literally are the boroughs of different cities. So we follow this guy who is from Brooklyn and who represents Brooklyn. We follow a girl who represents Queens. We follow someone who represents Manhattan. And there is this opposing force, this white lady who is just embodying kind of an alternate universe's hell-bent on destruction of this city. And all these boroughs have to team up together to fight this force that is embodied through gentrification and through violence. They kind of have to band together and take her on to save their city. This story is a wild, epic ride, and it obviously takes these characterizations of different boroughs of the city and the different conflicts that can happen within these different boroughs in this really creative and fascinating way. And I think that especially if you are from New York City, you really need to read this book, because it is so good at embodying the city and talking about different issues within the city through these character lines and plot lines that are just incredibly compelling and fast-paced and wonderful. The next book I have on this list is Fortune Favors the Dead by Stephen Spotswood. I've talked about this book so much on this channel at this point, and it's a mystery detective novel featuring 2 women detectives in their little duo as they're investigating a supposed murder case, supposed suicide case, and it's set in the 40s in New York City, and we see some of the queer spaces in the early 20th century of New York City. That is a really big part of the story, that culture of the really rich, wealthy people who frolic around the city and people who are on the underbelly of it, investigative journalists within the city, people who are obviously trying to solve crime, the cops within the city. This book talks about that all within the setting of this kind of grim, gritty, dark mystery kind of background that is still really quirky, fun, and light. Like, this book is very funny. It made me laugh out loud, and the writing style is very quippy, and our main character ran away to the circus, basically, and now she's working as a detective, and so she has a really strong sense of humor and backbone and really embodies what it means to, I think, you know, like, leave your past behind and come to the city and like become a new and better person and become who you truly are meant to be, basically. I think this book really, really incorporates the setting of New York City, especially in the 40s, so well in this narrative. The next book I have on this list is When No One Is Watching by Alyssa Cole. This book has also been hyped all over BookTube, and as you may have already known, it is a thriller suspense novel about gentrification, featuring this kind of romance between this Black woman who's going back to her Brooklyn brownstone, and because because her mother is sick or otherwise incapacitated, and she is trying to basically save her city as she notices that people around her are going missing, and her neighborhood is just rapidly changing into something that she doesn't recognize, and a lot of her neighbors are being displaced, and she is also in the process of also possibly being displaced. This book talks about gentrification, obviously, but within the context of Brooklyn and Brooklyn community within this specific neighborhood in this really fantastic way, and it is such a good book. And the last like 25% of this novel just, it packs a punch. It's very similar to the feeling you got when you watched Get Out, directed by Jordan Peele. It deals with almost similar themes and uses, I think, similar plot devices in that it really just rips the rug right from under your feet right when you are just trying to figure out what the hell is going on. So I cannot recommend this book enough. It is such a good story that is set in the really vibrant background of Brooklyn. The next book I have on this list is Such a Fun Age by Kylie Reed, another book that has been hyped all over BookTube, and I think that we don't necessarily talk enough about how New York City plays into this story, because I think it really is a major part of it, especially for the white woman in this story, who's the other main character, who runs her little girl boss company with like writing letters or whatever. She and her husband have moved out from the city, but she really misses the city, and that's a big part of the story, and obviously like that plays a major role in this story. And also like our main character Amira, the woman who nannies this white woman's child, runs into the love interest of the story who on like the subway, which I think is fun. And yeah, I think this book incorporates elements of that city, New York City background in a subtle but natural, and it's, I don't know, I think it's just a good story set in a good background, and it's very wild and just a very wild ride, the same way that, you know, like living in and being in New York City can be. The next book I have on this list is LaGuardia by Nnedi Okorafor. This is an Afrofuturist graphic novel where we're following this pregnant woman who is kind of smuggling some sort of alien from Nigeria through LaGuardia back to her apartment with her husband in New York City. And the art in this is fantastic. The discussions of immigration and these alien species and the incorporation of those things and those themes throughout this story is so fun and wild, and it's just a wonderful time. And you can see, like, with your eyes when you are looking at the comic book, how the city and the communities around this city and this airport specifically are really brightly colored and just gorgeously rendered. I really enjoyed this graphic novel, and it's really short, so you should pick it up. The next book on this recommendations list is Severance by Ling Ma. This book is about a pandemic in which this fungal matter that has emerged from this province in China has now spread all across the world, basically wiping people out. This illness takes into the human body and then deteriorates you from the inside out, in which you kind of continue to do the same mundane activities over and over again as your body just rots from the outside. And we're following this main character who is this Chinese immigrant, and she moved to the US when she was like 10, but then her parents died in a car crash, and now she is an adult, like in her early 20s, and she moved to New York City to work at this Bible publishing company. She's like one of the people who work at like the headquarters, and as this disease is ravaging the world and the city, all of her other coworkers and stuff are, going back home, leaving the city to, be with their family and stuff. But because she has no family, basically, she is kind of alone in this city with this guy that lives in her apartment that she's been hooking up with, basically. And this girl is one of the sole survivors in New York City at this point of the pandemic. She then creates this blog that's kind of like Ghost of New York, I think, and so she just takes a bunch of photos of this abandoned New York City and these stores and lots and places and parks that are just completely empty due to this disease killing everyone off or chasing everyone out of the city. And she remains unaffected by it for some reason, we're unsure, and she's just kind of documenting her surroundings and her existence anonymously online, being this loner wandering the city. This book talks about the deterioration of the city in just this gorgeous and really sad way, because as more and more of her coworkers die, more of her coworkers leave, she ends up being the only person in this office building, like, at all. And so as the elevator and as these different buildings and stuff are basically falling apart and no one else is living there, she kind of has to just deal with the aftermath of what it's like when a city falls apart because people are just dying en masse. So this book was really beautiful, I think, and it explored themes of motherhood. Please forgive this location change. I accidentally deleted the second part of the footage from filming yesterday. So that means that I'm refilming the last few recommendations on this list, which is why different setup. Let me know if you like it better. I don't know. Different face, different look in general. Anyways, let's just jump right back into it. I think I was talking about Severance last by Ling Ma, and that book was pretty good, pretty wild, and a really interesting exploration of what an emptied out pandemic New York City looks like. The next book I have on this list is My Year of Rest and Relaxation by Otessa Moshfegh. This book follows this Columbia grad who is this early 20s young woman whose parents recently died, and so now she just has come into a bunch of inheritance money, so now she's just living on an apartment in the Upper West Side, not really doing anything, and she decides to sleep for a year because she hates herself for a good reason. She is kind of a bad person and gross and not good, and so she decides, you know what, I'm gonna take this whole year and just take as many sleeping drugs as possible and try to sleep the whole year, so when I wake up the next year, I will be a better person. And because it's set in the Upper West Side, we see her as she, like, goes to her local bodega, and, like, her experience in the past working at a local, smaller, but really prestigious and snobby art gallery, and she eventually gets involved with some, like, partiers and art people in New York City, and I just feel like it explores that culture of just being, like, a rich person just kind of aimlessly doing whatever in New York City. And this book is a comedy, dark satire situation. We're not supposed to like the main character, so she is very deeply unlikable, but she also interacts with these other characters that are also deeply unlikable, like her best friend, who is kind of an alcoholic, and her psychiatrist, who is off her rocker. And yeah, this is just a really fun and wild book that is very dark, but also is very clearly and obviously set in New York City and discusses themes of what it's like to live in New York City as this rich white lady who basically has no responsibilities and you know, nothing that she really needs to take care of. So yeah, this was a really interesting read, and I would really recommend it. The next book I have on this list is Full Disclosure by Cameron Garrett. This is a young adult, hard-hitting contemporary following a Black teenage girl who is HIV positive, and she lives with her adoptive gay parents, and she has a really diverse friend group, but this, the inciting incident is when she starts dating this kid. She is the director of the school musical, which is Rent, and then she starts getting blackmail notes from someone, she doesn't know who, being like, if you don't stop dating this dude, I'm gonna tell the whole school that you're HIV positive. And so the book kind of follows along that, but I think it's really clearly set in, like, New York City and being, like, a teenager there, because we see as the main character and her friends, like, go to the sex shop for the first time, or go sit at the cafe and, like, talk about their issues, and the friendship dynamics and the different, like, dates in Central Park and whatever. I think it was a really cute portrayal of New York City and what it's like to, you know, come of age there and figure out yourself and your community and your identity. This book is a genuinely very good at dealing with all the topics that it discusses and touches on. Our main characters are all people of color and everyone is LGBTQ. So yeah, I think that this is a really solid, hard-hitting YA contemporary that you should definitely pick up if you're looking for something that's specifically set in New York City and has those vibes. So yeah, those are all of the book recommendations I have for you today that feature New York City. This is like my third time trying to film this end of video segment, so yeah, please leave a like and comment and subscribe if you haven't already. And all my social media links are down below as always. Let me know if you've read any of these books or if you feel like I've left out any New York City books that should be on this list. And let me know any of your thoughts if I mentioned something that you've read here. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!